My name is Eliza, and I'm 44 years old. I never thought something as small as my handwriting would become the reason my son-in-law tried to humiliate me. For as long as I could remember, I had been teased about the way I wrote. My letters slanted unevenly, as if they had been hurried out of my pen and thrown onto the page without much thought. Loops didn't quite close, lines ran too long, and the end result often looked more like a puzzle than words. As a child, teachers had scolded me, telling me to slow down, to try harder, to take pride in my penmanship. My classmates would peek over at my notebooks and giggle, whispering that I was writing in some secret language. Eventually, I learned not to care. My handwriting was mine, it was functional, it worked for me, and if others couldn't read it, that was their problem. But while I could shrug off the mockery of strangers, it was different when it came from family. And that's where Grant came in. Grant had married my daughter Harper 3 years ago. On the surface, he was charming, the kind of man who could walk into a room and command attention. He had the gift of gab, a quick smile, and a confidence that could convince anyone he knew what he was talking about. At least, that's how it seemed to people who didn't know him well. But I had seen past that mask from the start. Underneath the charm was arrogance, sharp, cutting arrogance that left others feeling smaller in his presence. He needed to be the smartest man in the room, and if he wasn't, he'd find a way to tear others down until he felt taller. Unfortunately, my daughter had fallen in love with his charisma before she noticed the cracks. And by then, she was in too deep to walk away easily. The first time he mocked my handwriting, it was subtle. I had left a note on the kitchen counter when I visited their home, reminding Harper to water the flowers I'd brought over. Later, Grant waved it in front of me with a smirk. "Eliza, you might need a translator for this," he joked, pretending to squint. Harper laughed awkwardly, and I smiled politely, telling myself it wasn't worth making a fuss. But over time, it escalated. It wasn't just quiet jabs anymore, he turned it into a performance. At family dinners, he'd hold up one of my grocery lists or notes and ask the table, "Anyone here good at ancient hieroglyphics?" If I scribbled down a recipe, he'd dramatically act out trying to read it, holding it upside down or pretending to grab a magnifying glass. Each time, Harper would murmur, "Grant, stop." But it was always half-hearted, like she was embarrassed but unwilling to challenge him too strongly. My heart ached for her. She had grown up in a home where love was steady, kind, and supportive. Yet now she was stuck with a man who thrived on tearing others down. I'll admit, I kept quiet. Not because I didn't have words, but because I knew something Grant didn't. My life wasn't as simple as he assumed. Yes, I was a mother, a widow who had built a quiet life, someone who loved gardening and kept stacks of journals in drawers. But I was also someone who had worked hard and made careful decisions. Over the years, I had quietly built a small real estate portfolio. Nothing flashy, but enough to ensure I would never be dependent on anyone. I didn't flaunt it. To me, security was meant to be felt, not shown off. My daughter knew very little about it, and Grant, well, he knew nothing at all. So when he laughed at my handwriting, all I could think was, if only he knew. If only he knew that the very signature he mocked was the same one that signed off on deeds, checks, contracts, and legal documents. The same shaky loops and hurried strokes he treated as a joke were the marks of ownership. My messy scrawl was tied to power he couldn't even imagine. Still, I let him go on, biting back the sting every time. I reminded myself that silence wasn't weakness. Silence could be strategy. That strategy would pay off one day. Because arrogant men like Grant always overplayed their hand. They always underestimated the quiet ones. The ones who didn't fight back right away. And when the truth finally came out, the shock was always sharper, the fall always harder. I watched Grant at these family gatherings, listened to him brag about his business ventures, his plans to dominate the market, whatever that meant. He carried himself like a king, dismissing small mistakes others made while never admitting to his own. He thought he was clever. He thought he was untouchable. And he thought I was beneath him, just an older woman with poor handwriting and nothing to her name. But I was patient. I knew the truth. And I knew that someday Grant would see my messy scrawl on something he couldn't laugh at. What Grant didn't know was that the very thing he mocked would one day hold power over his future. The first dinner where Grant mocked me in front of others still burns in my memory. It was a Sunday evening, one of those gatherings where Harper liked to invite not just family but a couple of her friends from work. She always had such a warm spirit, wanting everyone to feel included, wanting her home to feel alive with laughter and clinking glasses. I admired that about her. She had inherited my love of hospitality, though she dressed it up in a younger, livelier way. I had brought dessert, an old family recipe for peach cobbler that I scribbled down years ago on a faded notepad. I never needed to look at it anymore. But I kept the note tucked in my purse like a piece of family history. That evening, as Harper moved about the kitchen, I set the card down on the counter. Grant spotted it immediately. He plucked it up like he'd found buried treasure, then turned to the room with a grin that made my stomach twist. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced dramatically, "we have before us an ancient manuscript, written in a script, so mysterious that no living soul has ever been able to decipher it." The laughter came quickly from the guests, nervous at first, but laughter all the same. Grant faked a squint, then turned it upside down, as though that might help him read it better. "Ah yes, I think this says, 3 dragons and a pinch of fairy dust?" The group chuckled louder, encouraged by his performance. Harper's cheeks flushed pink. She reached out and tugged at his arm. "Grant, stop it. That's Mom's recipe." But he only grinned wider, brushing her off. "Oh, is it? Well, then I guess I should ask her, Mom, how many sorcerers does it take to make cobbler?" The laughter that followed wasn't malicious. Not from the guests anyway. They didn't know me well, and they certainly didn't know my handwriting. They were just following his lead. But each chuckle landed heavy, each smile carved a little deeper into my patience. I forced a laugh too, not because it was funny, but because I refused to let him see that it stung. That was what men like Grant wanted. They wanted the win, the reaction, the proof that their words had power. I wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I simply smiled and said, "Well, Grant, I suppose it's a good thing you'll never need to make it yourself." He laughed again, but I caught the flash of irritation in his eyes. My answer hadn't humiliated him, but it hadn't bowed down to his little performance either. And Grant didn't like when people slipped through his grip. Still, the moment stayed with me. Not because of the joke itself, but because of the way Harper's shoulders had sagged, the way she'd bitten her lip and stayed quiet after her attempt to stop him. I saw the discomfort in her eyes, the shame she carried on my behalf. That was when it truly hit me. Grant's mockery wasn't just about me. It was about Harper too. He mocked me openly because he knew Harper would never push back hard enough to stop him. And if he could undermine her mother, then what chance did she have of standing up for herself in her own home? I sat through the rest of the dinner quietly, observing him. He dominated every conversation, cutting others off mid-sentence to tell his stories. He bragged about a new deal he was working on, how he was sure it would make him a fortune, and how the people around him were lucky to be in his circle. The friends nodded politely, smiling when they were supposed to, but I saw their eyes too. I saw the subtle flickers of discomfort, the sideways glances. People like Grant thought they were admired when, in truth, most were just enduring them. When the evening ended and the guests trickled out, I helped Harper clear the dishes. She moved quickly, as though wanting to avoid conversation, but I gently placed a hand on her arm. "Harper, are you all right?" She gave me a tight smile. "Oh, you know Grant. He's just joking around." Her words were light, but her tone betrayed her. I wanted to press, to tell her she didn't have to excuse him, but I also knew pushing too hard could make her retreat. So I let it go, kissed her cheek, and told her the cobbler would keep just fine in the fridge. On the drive home, though, my mind churned. I thought about all the years I had lived quietly, building security with careful choices, saving every penny, investing when I could. I thought about the deeds tucked away in my safe, the papers signed with the very handwriting he mocked. He thought I was nothing more than a woman with messy script. He thought he was clever, superior, untouchable. But I knew better. I had lived long enough to know that arrogance is always fragile. Men like Grant rise quickly, boasting loudly, But they don't build on strong foundations, they build on ego, and ego cracks easily under pressure. I decided that night that I wouldn't confront him directly, not yet. That wasn't my way. I believed in timing, in letting people reveal their weaknesses before delivering the blow. Grant had already revealed more than he realized. His need to belittle me told me everything about the cracks in his character. I told myself to be patient. One day, the same handwriting he turned into a circus act would appear in front of him again, and this time, he wouldn't be able to laugh. This time, the jokes would turn to silence. He had no idea his arrogance was digging a pit he would eventually fall into. The more I observed Grant, the more I saw a pattern that went beyond me. At first, I thought his comments about my handwriting were isolated, just a petty way to make himself feel clever at my expense. But the more time I spent around him, the more I realized that mocking me wasn't the exception. It was the rule. Grant had a way of inserting himself into every conversation and turning it into a stage. He always had to be the loudest, the most informed, the most admired. If someone else tried to share an experience, he'd interrupt, cut them off, and steer the story back to himself. And when he couldn't make himself look bigger, he'd make others look smaller. It wasn't just me. I saw it when we went out to dinner one night. The young waiter stumbled over the specials, clearly nervous, and Grant leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "You might want to practice that in the mirror next time, champ," he said loudly enough for the entire table to hear. The poor boy's ears went red, and he rushed away to fetch our drinks. I looked at Harper, expecting her to say something, but she just forced a smile and busied herself with her napkin. Another time, Harper told me she'd forgotten to pay a bill on time because she was swamped at work. Instead of shrugging it off, Grant laughed and said, "Good thing you married me, huh? Otherwise, you'd be living on the street by now." He said it like a joke, but I watched Harper's shoulders stiffen, the way her smile didn't reach her eyes. It wasn't a joke to her, it was a jab. The pattern was clear. Grant didn't just mock me because of my handwriting, he mocked anyone who gave him the chance. It was his way of maintaining control, of feeding his ego. And I hated to admit it, but Harper was his favorite target. It broke my heart. My daughter, who had once been so full of light, so confident in herself, was shrinking. She made excuses for him, laughed off his cutting remarks, and told me she didn't mind when I knew she did. I had raised her to be strong, but strength looks different when you're living inside someone else's storm. I wanted to confront him. I wanted to tell him to stop tearing her down, to stop using his words like knives. But I also knew that if I pushed too hard, Harper might retreat. She wasn't ready yet to see the full truth about him. She was still clinging to the man she thought she'd married, the charming, witty, ambitious man who had swept her off her feet. So instead of speaking up, I watched. And the more I watched, the more I saw his mask slipping. He boasted constantly about his financial genius, about his investments and ventures, but the details never quite added up. One month he was bragging about stocks, the next it was cryptocurrency, the next it was flipping houses. He spoke with such confidence that it sounded convincing, but there was a desperation underneath it, like a man trying to talk himself into believing his own lies. I began to suspect that Grant wasn't nearly as secure as he pretended to be. And if that was true, then his arrogance was built on nothing more than sand. One evening, I stayed late at their house after dinner. Grant excused himself to take a phone call in the next room, but he didn't close the door all the way. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but his voice carried easily. "No, I told you, I'll have it by the end of the month," he snapped. "Don't threaten me, I've got money coming in. I just need more time." My stomach tightened. He wasn't the confident businessman he portrayed. He was a man scrambling to keep up with debts, promising money he didn't have. That was the night I knew with certainty. Grant wasn't just arrogant. He was fragile. And fragile arrogance is dangerous. Not just for the person who carries it, but for everyone around them. When I left their house that evening, I sat in my car for a long while, staring out at the dark street. My mind raced with questions. Should I tell Harper what I'd overheard? Should I confront Grant directly? Or should I bide my time, let him unravel on his own? Patience won. It always did with me. I had spent years building my life quietly, investing when I could, saving diligently. I knew the value of waiting, of choosing the right moment instead of rushing in unprepared. And I sensed that my moment with Grant hadn't arrived yet. But I also knew it would. Because arrogance like his can't hide forever. It always overplays itself, always collapses under its own weight. And when it did, I wanted to be there not to save him, but to protect Harper and to finally show him the truth. I started to picture it in my mind. Grant, standing there with that smug look on his face, suddenly confronted with the reality of who I really was. The realization dawning on him that the messy handwriting he laughed at was tied to power he could never match. That my crooked signature wasn't a weakness, it was the mark of everything he thought he owned but didn't. That day would come. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I could feel it. So I stayed silent, waiting, watching. Letting him dig his own grave with every cruel remark, every false boast, every smug smirk. What he thought was harmless mocking was quietly building his downfall. The phone call that revealed everything came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I remember the day clearly because the sky matched the heaviness in Harper's voice. The rain beat steadily against my windows as I sat in the living room with a cup of tea and one of my old journals open on my lap. I wasn't writing that day, just flipping through old pages. My eyes tracing the crooked letters only I could fully read. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of my phone buzzing across the table. It was Harper. The moment I answered, I heard it, the tightness in her throat, the strain she was trying to disguise. "Mom, are you busy?" she asked, her voice low, almost guilty. "Never too busy for you, sweetheart. What's wrong?" I asked, sitting up straighter. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear her swallow. Then, in a rush, she said, "We're in trouble. Financially, the bills are piling up, the mortgage is killing us, and..." She trailed off before whispering, "Grant's investments didn't work out the way he said they would." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, my chest tightening. I had suspected as much, but hearing her admit it out loud made it real. "How bad is it?" I asked gently. "Bad," she said simply. "We're behind on payments. Creditors are calling. We don't have enough to cover next month's mortgage. And Grant, he keeps saying it's just a temporary setback, but I don't know if I can believe him anymore." Her voice cracked on that last part, and I closed my eyes, hating that my daughter was carrying this burden. "Harper," I said softly, "take a breath. You don't have to go through this alone. Tell me what you need." Another silence, heavier this time. Then she whispered, "Could we borrow some money? Just enough to help us get through this?" I could hear the shame in her tone. Harper had always been proud, independent. Asking me for help wasn't easy for her, and I knew in my bones that this request didn't come from her alone. It came from Grant too, though I doubted he'd been the one to pick up the phone. His pride would never allow it. "Of course," I told her, my voice calm and steady. "Why don't we sit down together? You and Grant. We'll go over things and see what can be done." Relief rushed into her voice. "Thank you, Mom. Really. We can't tell anyone else. It's embarrassing." I reassured her and hung up, but I stayed there on the couch for a long while, staring at the rain streaking down the window. I felt anger not at Harper, but at Grant. At his arrogance, his recklessness, his need to play the big man while dragging my daughter into his chaos. And I felt something else too, a flicker of opportunity. Because now the cracks in his facade were widening. And soon, his pride would have no choice but to bow. When I arrived at their house later that week, the tension was palpable. Harper opened the door with tired eyes, her smile forced. Grant was already in the living room, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed like he was about to negotiate a business deal instead of ask his mother-in-law for help. "Eliza," he said smoothly, standing just enough to shake my hand. "Thanks for coming." I studied him closely. He still carried himself with that practiced charm, but I noticed the shadows under his eyes, the stiffness in his movements. His confidence was cracked, no matter how hard he tried to mask it. Harper sat beside him, clutching a folder of bills and overdue notices. Her hands trembled slightly as she spread them out on the table. We're falling behind, Mom," she admitted. her voice quiet. Grant jumped in quickly, waving a hand dismissively. It's not as bad as it looks. Just some temporary liquidity issues. You know how the markets are unpredictable. I've got things in motion, but we just need a little cushion to get through this rough patch. I almost laughed at the way he spun it, as though they weren't drowning in debt but merely inconvenienced by timing. He was still trying to sell me the same lines he probably told Harper, every day. And how much of a cushion are we talking about? I asked calmly. Grant leaned forward, lowering his voice like we were partners in some secret deal. 10,000 should cover immediate needs, just until my next venture kicks in. Easy money. I turned my eyes to Harper. She wouldn't meet my gaze. That told me everything I needed to know. She didn't believe his promises anymore either. I let a silence stretch, long enough for Grant to fidget slightly. Then I said, I might have a better solution than just throwing money at the problem. His eyebrows rose. Oh? I folded my hands neatly. I own a property. A small brick house, 2 stories, in a quiet neighborhood. It's been rented out for years. But it's vacant now. If you and Harper want, you can move in there for the time being, rent-free. That way, you can sell this house, pay off the debts, and breathe again. The room went still. Harper's eyes widened, her mouth parting in shock. Mom, you own another house? I nodded, smiling softly. I do. It's nothing fancy, but it's fully paid off. It'll give you both a chance to reset without drowning under this mortgage. Grant tried to hide his surprise, but he wasn't quick enough. His mask slipped, and I caught the flicker of disbelief, maybe even intimidation. He hadn't expected me to have anything more than a savings account, let alone real estate. He recovered quickly, forcing a smile. Well, that's generous, he said slowly. Then, with a smirk, he added, as long as we don't have to read your handwriting on the lease, right? Harper groaned softly. Grant. But I only smiled, my heart steady. His words no longer stung. Not when I knew the truth. Because the very handwriting he mocked was the same one that had signed the deed to the house he would soon be living in. The very signature he laughed at was the one that gave him shelter when his own arrogance had left him exposed. And that's when I realized I had the leverage I'd been waiting for. Grant believed I was coming to save him, but I was really coming to teach him. When I made the offer of the house, Harper's face lit up with a kind of hope I hadn't seen in her for months. Relief washed over her, like a weight had been lifted from her chest. She grabbed my hand across the table, tears shimmering in her eyes. Mom, I don't even know what to say. Thank you. Grant, on the other hand, sat back in his chair with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was gratitude there, faint and reluctant, but it was buried under something else: pride, discomfort, and maybe even resentment. Accepting help from me wasn't in line with the image he'd built of himself. To take my offer meant admitting he'd failed, and Grant didn't like admitting weakness. Still, he wasn't stupid enough to turn it down. Yes, thank you, Eliza, he said with a strained smile. That's very generous. And it's temporary, of course. Just until I get us back on track. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. I didn't correct him. I didn't remind him that temporary depended entirely on whether he could keep his promises. A track record that was, so far, less than reliable. Over the next week, Harper and Grant began preparing to move. Harper called me almost every day with questions about the house, what the neighborhood was like, what condition it was in, whether she could redecorate. I told her yes, and yes again. My goal was never to control her, only to give her freedom. Grant, however, was another story. When I brought over the keys and a small packet of paperwork to formalize their arrangement, he couldn't help himself. He picked up the single-page agreement I'd drafted, a simple acknowledgement that they were living there rent-free, and squinted dramatically at my signature. Ah, here we go again, he said, chuckling to himself. Looks like someone's been practicing their hieroglyphics. Do we need a Rosetta Stone to make this official? Harper's face tightened, but she said nothing. I only smiled calmly and tucked the papers back into my folder. "You'll find, Grant," I said softly, "that my signature carries more weight than you realize." He laughed again, dismissing my words as though they were nothing more than a quip. But I saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. Even he knew that documents like deeds and contracts didn't care how pretty the letters looked. They only cared about the name behind them. And mine was the one holding the pen. Moving day arrived in a whirlwind of boxes, tape, and frayed tempers. Harper bustled about with determination, trying to keep everything organized, while Grant wandered through the new house with a critical eye. "This kitchen is outdated," he muttered, pulling open cabinets. "We'll need to gut this if we're going to live here long term." "It's temporary," Harper reminded him gently, though I could hear the edge in her voice. He moved on to the living room, tapping the walls as though he were a building inspector. Not the best construction. I mean, it'll do for now, but I prefer something more modern." I bit back a smile. If only he knew how carefully I had chosen this house years ago. Solid brick, well built, in a neighborhood where property values had steadily climbed. He saw flaws where there were none, simply because he couldn't bear the thought of being dependent on me. By the time the sun set and the last box was carried in, Harper looked exhausted but grateful. She hugged me tightly, whispering, "Mom, I don't know how we would have managed without you." Grant muttered a thanks without meeting my eyes, his pride still choking him. He busied himself with unpacking, deliberately avoiding any genuine acknowledgement. I didn't press. I didn't need him to thank me. Because gratitude wasn't the point of this arrangement. The point was simple. He was standing inside a house he didn't own, one secured by the signature he mocked. Every wall, every floorboard, every shingle overhead, it all belonged to me, and no amount of arrogance could change that fact. Over the next few weeks, I watched the shift happen slowly. At first, Grant strutted around as though he still held control, making big plans for renovations and talking about how temporary this arrangement was. But reality has a way of eroding arrogance. He had to call the utility companies under my name. He had to consult me when questions about the property arose. He had to watch, time and again, as my messy scrawl appeared on official papers that allowed him to live comfortably while his own finances lay in ruins. I never gloated. That wasn't my style. Instead, I answered his questions calmly, offered solutions when problems arose, and carried myself with quiet authority. And that quietness unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. Because deep down, he knew. He knew the woman whose handwriting he mocked was the same woman holding his safety net. He knew his arrogance had been misplaced, and the imbalance of power had shifted. Still, he clung desperately to what scraps of pride he had left. At dinner one evening, he tried to joke again. "Well, at least the house came with legible instructions for the appliances. Wouldn't want to rely on Eliza's notes for that, right?" Harper shot him a look, sharper than usual, and said nothing. But I noticed. I noticed the weariness in her eyes, the way she no longer found his jokes funny. Little by little, his attempts to mock me were falling flat, not because I defended myself, but because his own wife had stopped playing along. And that was when I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. Grant's need to belittle me had been a symptom of a much larger problem. He belittled everyone, especially Harper. And the more his life unraveled, the harsher his words became. Harper didn't need just a safe house, she needed a safe future. So, while Grant thought I was simply offering him a lifeline, I was already planning something much bigger, something permanent. Because my goal wasn't just to silence his mockery. My goal was to show him, once and for all, that arrogance has no power in the face of quiet strength. He laughed at my signature then, but soon it would wipe the smile off his face. Moving day revealed more about Grant than I ever wanted to know. The first morning after Harper and Grant had officially settled into the house, I stopped by with muffins and coffee. I wanted to check in, make sure they were comfortable, and give Harper a little encouragement. She greeted me at the door with messy hair and tired eyes, but a grateful smile. "Mom, you're a lifesaver," she whispered, hugging me tightly. Grant wasn't as warm. He leaned against the kitchen counter, arms folded, surveying the muffins like they were an insult. "Well," he said, I guess it's a little early for carbs. But thanks. I brushed it off, setting the basket on the counter. Harper immediately pulled one out, sighing with relief as she bit into it. You don't know how nice it is not to worry about groceries for once, she said. Grant gave a half laugh. We're not exactly starving, Harper. Let's not be dramatic. But I could see the truth written all over her face. They had been drowning. The debt, the bills, the constant pressure, it had been eating her alive. Now, for the first time in months, she was breathing again. Grant, however, was restless. Over the next week, he couldn't stop pointing out the so-called flaws of the house. The kitchen's outdated. We need granite countertops if we're going to have people over. The carpet in the living room looks old. Shouldn't we rip it out and put in hardwood? The yard's too plain. If we plant a few trees, it might look more like a real property. Every comment was laced with disdain, as though he were living in a shack instead of a well-maintained home in a respectable neighborhood. He carried himself like a man forced to lower his standards, when in truth, he was lucky to have a roof over his head at all. Harper tried to shush him. It's free, Grant. We don't have to pay a cent to live here. Can't you just be grateful? But gratitude wasn't in his vocabulary. Pride was, and pride doesn't do well when faced with dependence. I never snapped back at him, though the temptation gnawed at me. Instead, I listened calmly, nodding occasionally, watching him dig himself deeper with every complaint. My silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. He thought he was criticizing me, but really, he was revealing his own insecurities. One evening, I stopped by to drop off some gardening supplies Harper had asked for. Grant was in the living room, rifling through a stack of mail. He didn't notice me at first. What's this? He muttered, holding up an envelope addressed to me. Property tax notice, I answered, walking in. He jumped slightly, then quickly masked it with a smirk. Ah, so this is what it looks like to actually own something. Fascinating. He tapped the envelope against his hand, then squinted at the return address. You really handle all this paperwork yourself? With that handwriting of yours, I'm surprised the county clerk doesn't laugh you out of the office. Harper groaned softly, embarrassed. Grant, I smiled, calm as ever. You'd be surprised what my signature can accomplish. He chuckled, dismissing me as usual, but I noticed how long he lingered on the envelope before setting it down. He was curious now. Curious, and maybe a little unsettled. The following days, his behavior shifted. He still mocked occasionally, but I saw a new edge in his eyes, something uncertain. When Harper and I chatted about the house or the garden, he listened more closely than before. It was as though he was trying to piece together a puzzle, to understand how the woman he thought was beneath him held more power than he realized. But his arrogance wouldn't let him admit it out loud. Instead, he doubled down on criticism. One Saturday, Harper and I worked in the backyard planting flowers. She knelt beside me in the dirt, laughing as we dug together like we used to when she was a girl. Grant came outside halfway through, a beer in his hand, and surveyed the scene with disdain. Really? Petunias? If we're going to bother, we should at least put in something valuable. Roses. Or maybe a fountain. Something with curb appeal. Harper rolled her eyes. Grant, it's not about curb appeal. It's about making the place feel like home. He scoffed, taking a swig of his drink. Home. Right. His tone dripped with bitterness, as if the word itself offended him. I leaned back on my heels, brushing dirt from my gloves. A home is what you make it, Grant, I said gently. Not what you own. For a moment, he was silent. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing just slightly. Then he turned and went back inside without another word. That small exchange told me everything. He was struggling. The image he'd built of himself, the successful provider, the man in control, was crumbling. And the worst part, for him, was that I was the one holding the pieces together. By the end of the month, Harper seemed lighter, happier. She cooked more, smiled more, even started humming again while she cleaned. She had space to breathe, to live without fear of bills piling up. But Grant's mood only soured. The more comfortable Harper grew, the more he resented it. Because deep down, he knew that comfort came from me, not him, and for a man like Grant, that was intolerable. One evening, as we sat down for dinner together, he finally let some of that resentment slip. He glanced at the casserole dish I'd brought over and muttered, "I suppose we should thank Eliza again. Seems like everything here has her name on it these days." The room went still. Harper's fork clinked softly against her plate as she set it down. I met his eyes calmly, holding his gaze. "Yes, Grant," I said softly. "It does." He blinked, caught off guard by my directness. For once, he had no ready comeback. No joke. No smirk. He just looked down at his plate, his pride bruised. And in that silence, I knew something important. The cracks were widening. His arrogance was no longer unshakable. Soon, those cracks would break wide open. But his fragile ego was about to be shattered by ink on paper. The first time Grant laid eyes on the deed, the laughter caught in his throat. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. I had stopped by to drop off a few important documents. Since Harper and Grant were living in my rental property, I needed them to sign a simple rental acknowledgement form, not a lease, nothing binding, just a formality so there would be no misunderstandings later. I carried the folder tucked neatly under my arm, filled with papers I had organized earlier that morning. On top, almost by accident, was a copy of the deed. It wasn't necessary for them to see, but I'd pulled it out of my files in case Harper wanted reassurance that the house was truly secure. When I arrived, Harper greeted me warmly. She led me to the dining table, where Grant was already sitting with his laptop open, pretending to be busy. He glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of my folder. "What's all that?" he asked, his tone light but edged with suspicion. "Just a little paperwork," I said, setting the folder down. "Harper, I thought it might help if you both signed this acknowledgement, just for clarity's sake." Harper nodded, reaching for a pen. But before she could sign, Grant reached over, flipping the folder open with a careless hand, and that was when he saw it, the deed. His eyes skimmed over the thick official paper, his smirk fading as he recognized the words printed across the top, "Warranty Deed." He blinked, leaning closer, his fingers tightening on the page as though he wasn't sure he was seeing it correctly. And then he saw my name. Eliza Morgan, written in the same uneven scrawl he had mocked countless times. My signature stretched across the bottom of the page, crooked and messy, yet stamped with the county clerk's seal. That same scrawl he'd called chicken scratch. That same signature he'd turned into a running joke. It wasn't just handwriting. It was ownership. Authority. Power. Grant chuckled, but it was weak this time, hollow. This is yours?" he asked, his voice caught between disbelief and something else. "Yes," I said calmly. "Paid in full, years ago. This house has been mine since Harper was still in college." Harper looked at me, her eyes wide. "Mom, you never told me you owned a whole other house." I smiled at her gently. I didn't think it was necessary at the time. Grant stared down at the paper, his face pale. I could see the war raging inside him, the urge to laugh it off, to mock me again, clashing with the undeniable truth in front of him. He tried to recover, tried to summon his usual bravado. "Well, I mean," he stammered. "Good for you, Eliza. Who knew you were, quite the investor." He forced a chuckle, glancing at Harper as if to gauge her reaction. But Harper wasn't laughing. She was staring at me with awe, a flicker of pride in her eyes. For the first time, she saw me not just as her mother, but as a woman who had built something lasting, something strong. Grant, however, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He tapped the deed against the table, his jaw tightening. "Still," he muttered, trying to salvage his ego. "You'd think you'd at least hire someone to make your signature legible. Kind of funny, isn't it? That something this important looks like it was scribbled by a child?" "Funny or not, Grant, that scribble makes me the legal owner of the house you're sitting in." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. For the first time since I had met him, Grant didn't have a comeback. Harper's lips twitched, as though she wanted to smile but didn't dare. Grant's face reddened slightly, and he quickly shoved the deed back into the folder, as if hiding it could erase what he'd just seen. But it was too late. The image had already burned into his mind. My messy signature, stamped with authority, holding power over his life. The shift was subtle at first, but I noticed it immediately. That evening, Grant was quieter than usual. He didn't crack any jokes about my lists or recipes. He didn't sneer at my notes. Instead, he picked at his dinner in silence, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Harper tried to fill the quiet with small talk, but the air felt different, heavier somehow. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The deed had spoken louder than I ever could. Later that week, I caught him in the living room, flipping through the folder again when he thought no one was looking. His eyes lingered on my signature, tracing the loops and jagged lines. He didn't mock it this time. He just stared, as though trying to reconcile the handwriting he ridiculed with the authority it carried. It unsettled him. I could see it in the way his posture stiffened when I walked into the room, in the way his words grew cautious around me. He had always underestimated me. Always treated me like a harmless background character in his story. But now, he was beginning to realize that I wasn't background at all. I was the foundation beneath his feet. The realization shook him, though he'd never admit it. His arrogance was cracked, and through those cracks, fear began to seep in. He masked it with forced laughter, with shallow jokes, but the truth was clear. He had seen my signature on something that mattered, and it had silenced him. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. And for the first time, my handwriting silenced him. From that day forward, Grant couldn't stop thinking about my handwriting. Something had shifted in him after he saw the deed. He didn't say it outright, of course he wouldn't, but I saw it in the way his eyes followed me. In the way he hesitated before opening his mouth. In the way his mocking laughter had dried up. For years, my handwriting had been his favorite punchline. Now it was the one thing he couldn't stop staring at. At first, it showed in subtle questions. Over dinner one evening, as Harper and I chatted about gardening, he interrupted casually. "So, Eliza, how many properties do you actually own?" His tone was light, feigning curiosity, but his eyes were sharp, probing. I smiled, spooning potatoes onto my plate. "Enough to keep me busy." He leaned forward. "And you manage them yourself? The paperwork, the legal stuff, all of it?" I met his gaze calmly. "I've been handling it for years. My signature is on every document." Something flickered in his expression: frustration. Maybe even intimidation. He forced a laugh, leaning back. "Well, I suppose that explains the hieroglyphics. The county clerks must love you." But the joke fell flat. Harper didn't laugh this time. She simply glanced at him, then back at me, and changed the subject. The more questions he asked, the vaguer my answers became. I never lied, but I never gave him the full picture either. If he wanted to know the scope of what I'd built, he'd have to sit with the uncertainty. And uncertainty, I was beginning to realize, was his weakness. The man who thrived on control, who needed to be the loudest in the room, was unraveling under the weight of not knowing. I saw it in the way he hovered when Harper and I spoke, pretending to be busy on his phone while listening closely. I saw it in the way he lingered near my papers if I left them on the counter, his eyes drawn to my messy signature as though it might reveal secrets if he stared long enough. But the truth was simple. The more he mocked, the more power that signature held, because now, he knew without a doubt that those crooked loops and jagged lines carried authority he couldn't touch. One Saturday afternoon, Harper invited me over to help her rearrange some furniture. While we moved a bookshelf, Grant sat on the couch, sipping a drink and watching us. Out of nowhere, he said, "So, Eliza, you've really kept all this quiet. You must be sitting on a fortune." Harper looked up sharply. "Grant." "What?" he said innocently, shrugging. "I'm just saying, your mom's got resources. More than we realized." He turned his gaze back to me. "You must have some kind of strategy, right? Some secret investment plan?" I set the stack of books down slowly, dusting off my hands. "No secret," I said simply. just patience, and a lot of hard work. He studied me for a long moment, then gave a tight smile. Right, hard work. But his eyes betrayed him. He was calculating, trying to piece it together, trying to figure out just how much I had and why I hadn't flaunted it. That was the part he couldn't comprehend. To Grant, wealth was meant to be displayed, bragged about, used as a weapon. The idea that someone could own property, have financial security, and yet live simply, it baffled him. And it terrified him, because it meant that I had power without needing to shout about it. Quiet power. The kind that unsettled men like him more than any loud boast ever could. Over the following weeks, his curiosity grew into something like obsession. He began dropping little hints, trying to lure me into revealing more. So, Eliza, ever thought about expanding your portfolio? Maybe we could go in on something together. Or, if you ever need someone to help manage all that paperwork, I've got the experience. Each time, I smiled politely, answering just enough to keep him off balance. I never gave him the satisfaction of knowing the full truth. Meanwhile, Harper began to notice the change too. One evening, while we were alone in the kitchen, she whispered, "Mom, have you noticed how quiet he is around you now? He doesn't make those jokes anymore." I smiled softly. "Yes, I've noticed." She frowned. Confused. "It's strange. I don't understand why he's suddenly so careful." I didn't answer. It wasn't time for her to know the full truth, not yet. But I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was beginning to see what I saw, the cracks in his pride. The way his arrogance faltered in my presence. And the more it faltered, the more obvious it became that his power had always been an illusion. One evening, Grant finally snapped. I had stopped by with some fresh vegetables from my garden, setting the basket on their kitchen counter. As Harper unpacked them, Grant leaned against the fridge, watching me carefully. "You know," he said slowly, "I used to think your handwriting was just messy. But now I realize it's dangerous. You sign things with that, and suddenly, people like us are living in your house. Kind of funny, isn't it?" I turned to face him, meeting his gaze without blinking. "It's not funny, Grant. It's reality." The silence that followed was thick. Harper looked between us, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding the depth of it. Grant opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once, he had no clever remark, no cutting joke. Just silence. And in that silence, I saw the truth. He wasn't mocking me anymore. He was afraid of me. Not because I'd threatened him, not because I'd raised my voice, but because my messy handwriting had exposed the lie of his superiority. He had built his identity on being the strongest, the smartest, the most powerful man in the room. And now, he couldn't deny that the power rested with me. He finally realized I wasn't someone he could ridicule without consequence. Family dinners became eerily quiet without his jokes at my expense. For the longest time, family gatherings had been his stage. Grant thrived on those moments, holding up my grocery lists for everyone to laugh at, mimicking my handwriting in exaggerated scrawls, making Harper blush with embarrassment. He would always smirk at me afterward, like he'd won some invisible contest. But after he saw the deed, after he realized my signature carried power, the laughter stopped. At first, the silence was almost disorienting. We sat around the dinner table, Harper chatting about work, me asking questions about her garden. And Grant barely spoke at all. He poked at his food, offered the occasional nod, but the endless stream of smug remarks was gone. And I'll admit it, his silence was sweeter than any revenge I could have planned. I savored it. Each quiet meal felt like a small victory. Each pause where he might have once mocked me but didn't was proof that he had finally learned caution. The man who once tried to make me small now sat shrinking in his own discomfort. But I knew men like Grant. Silence wasn't permanent. Arrogance doesn't disappear overnight, it only waits, like a balloon desperate to be filled with air again. And sooner or later, he would try to reassert himself. That moment came on a warm Sunday evening. Harper had invited me over for dinner, wanting to cook one of my old recipes as a surprise. She worked happily in the kitchen, humming softly, while I set the table. Grant, as usual, sat on the couch with his laptop open, pretending to be busy. When Harper called us to the table, he finally closed the laptop and joined us, his posture a little too stiff. For the first half of the meal, he remained quiet, letting Harper and me carry the conversation. But then, out of nowhere, he cleared his throat. "You know," he began, his tone forcedly casual, "I've been working on a new business plan." Harper froze for a moment, her fork halfway to her mouth. She glanced at me quickly, then set it down. "Another one?" she asked carefully. Grant smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yes. This one's different though, it's a sure thing. I've been talking with some investors, and we're going to launch something big, real estate, tech integration, cutting edge. This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for." His words flowed easily, as they always did when he boasted. He painted a grand picture of success, of wealth pouring in, of a future where they'd finally have it all. I listened silently, sipping my tea. I didn't interrupt, I didn't argue. I didn't even roll my eyes. Because I didn't need to. I'd learned long ago that silence could be sharper than words. By saying nothing, I forced him to keep talking, to dig deeper, to reveal the hollowness of his promises. Sure enough, Harper finally asked the question that mattered. "And how much is this going to cost us?" Grant faltered. "Just for a second, but it was enough. It's an investment," he said vaguely. "A small buy-in for now, with huge potential returns later." I set my teacup down gently. "And how do you plan to buy in, Grant? With what money?" His eyes flicked to me, irritation flashing across his face. "I have connections. Not everything requires cash up front." "Of course," I said softly, folding my hands in my lap. "Connections. Just be sure those connections don't end with another phone call demanding payment." The silence that followed was heavy. Harper's head snapped toward me, confusion in her eyes. She didn't know what I had overheard weeks ago, the heated phone call where he begged for more time, insisting he had money coming. Grant's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came. Instead, he pushed his plate back slightly and leaned away, his face dark. I had struck the nerve, and I hadn't needed to raise my voice to do it. That evening, as I left their house, I felt the weight of something shifting. The balance of power was tilting. Grant had always seen me as an easy target. Someone to mock, someone to diminish. Now, he was the one diminished. But I also knew this wasn't over. Men like Grant don't crumble all at once. They chip away, bit by bit, until one day the foundation gives out. He would try again, I was sure of it. He would try to inflate his ego, to reassert control, to prove he was still the man he claimed to be. And when he did, because I wasn't just waiting for him to fall anymore, I was preparing. Preparing for the moment when his arrogance would finally collapse under the weight of reality. Preparing for the moment when Harper would see the truth for herself. Preparing for the moment when my handwriting, the very thing he once laughed at, would close the door on his delusions forever. And when it did, I would be ready. The breaking point came when Grant turned his cruelty on Harper. For months, I had endured his arrogance in silence, letting him unravel under the weight of his own pride. But there are some things a mother cannot stay silent about. And the night I heard my daughter crying on the phone, her voice breaking as she tried to tell me what had happened, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. It started at a dinner party with some of Harper's colleagues. She'd told me about it later, her words trembling. She had been excited, wanting to make a good impression. She dressed up, cooked a beautiful meal, and made sure the house was spotless. Everything was perfect until Grant opened his mouth. In front of her friends, in front of people who respected her, he laughed and said, "You'll have to excuse Harper if she's a little off with numbers. She's sweet, but she's not exactly the financial brain of this family." He said it with that same smug smile he always wore when cutting someone down. He thought it was harmless, a joke. But Harper told me how the room went quiet, how her colleagues forced polite smiles, how her cheeks burned as she tried to laugh it off. Later, when the guests left, she confronted him. But instead of apologizing, he doubled down. "What? It's true. You'd be lost without me handling the money." That night, she called me, sobbing into the phone. "Mom, I can't keep doing this. He makes me feel so small. He doesn't even see me anymore." I sat in my living room, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. My daughter, the girl I had raised to be strong and kind, was being diminished in her own home by the man who vowed to love her, and I couldn't allow it to continue. "Harper," I said firmly, "you are not small, you never have been. And if Grant can't see that, then it's time he learns a lesson he'll never forget." She sniffled. "What do you mean?" I didn't answer directly, not yet. She wasn't ready for the full truth of what I had in mind. But I promised her, "You'll understand soon, and you'll never have to feel this way again." The next few days, I began to prepare. I pulled out my files, the deeds, the trust documents, the wills I had updated over the years. Each one bore my messy signature at the bottom, the same loops and lines Grant had mocked so often. But these weren't just papers, they were shields. Weapons, even. Proof of the life I had built. The legacy I intended to leave behind. Every signature was a reminder of my power, of my foresight, of the empire he had no idea existed. For years, I had kept these things quiet, not out of secrecy, but out of humility. I never felt the need to flaunt what I had, but, now, I realized silence was no longer enough. My daughter needed to see what strength looked like. And Grant needed to see just how small his arrogance truly was. One evening, I invited Harper over while Grant was at a meeting. We sat at my dining table as I laid out the documents in front of her, one by one. Her eyes widened with every page she turned. "Mom, you own all this?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded. "Yes," quietly, patiently, for years, and every decision I made with you in mind. "One day, all of this will be yours, Harper, not his. I've structured it so he can never touch it, never squander it." Tears filled her eyes. "I had no idea. You never said anything." I smiled gently. "Some things don't need to be said until the right moment, and this, my love, is the right moment." She reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing it tightly. "Mom, thank you. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I told her. "But you do need to see yourself the way I see you, strong, capable, worthy of more than the scraps he gives you. You don't need Grant to validate you. You don't need anyone to." She nodded, wiping her tears, and for the first time in a long while, I saw a spark in her eyes. But my work wasn't done. Grant still walked around with his fragile pride, pretending to be in control. He still believed he held the upper hand. And until he saw the full scope of the truth, until he was forced to confront it, he would never stop diminishing Harper or me. So I made a decision. The next time he tried to rise above me, to reassert himself, I would end it. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with undeniable proof. Proof written in the very handwriting he despised. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming respect. For me, for Harper, for every moment he had stolen with his cutting words. The stage was set, the papers were ready. And soon, Grant would be confronted with the reality he could no longer ignore. This time, silence would not be enough. I began preparing my revenge not with words, but with signatures. Some people think revenge is loud shouting matches, slam doors, or public humiliation. But I had learned long ago that the most devastating revenge is quiet. It isn't in raised voices or dramatic gestures. It's in the calm, deliberate steps that cannot be undone. And mine began with pen and paper. I spread my documents across the dining table one evening. Property deeds, bank account information, my will, and a trust I had been building for years. Every piece of paper bore my messy, crooked signature. To the untrained eye, it might have looked chaotic. To Grant, it had always been a punchline. But here, on these official pages, my handwriting carried weight. It was proof of ownership, security, and foresight. And I was going to make sure every line of ink served as a shield for Harper and a barrier against him. The first step was updating my will. Originally, I had left everything to Harper without much stipulation. But now, I added a crucial clause. Grant would have no claim to any of it, not even by marriage. If anything ever happened to me, everything would pass directly into a trust solely for Harper's benefit. He could not touch it, borrow against it, or squander it on his doomed business ventures. Next, I reviewed the trust documents. Over the years, I had funneled my assets into a carefully structured plan designed to protect Harper's future. I updated them, strengthening the language, ensuring there were no loopholes. Every property, every account, every investment was tied neatly into her hands, and with every signature I added, my hand steady even in its messiness, I felt stronger. My handwriting wasn't just marks on a page, it was armor, it was justice. When I finished, I sat back and looked at the stack of papers. They didn't look like much, just ink and paper, but they were the culmination of decades of work, of sacrifices, of quiet discipline. And now, they were the weapon that would end Grant's reign of arrogance. The following weekend, I invited Harper over again. This time, I didn't ease her in. I wanted her to see everything. I laid the documents out on the table and gestured for her to sit. "Mom, what is all this?" she asked, her brow furrowing as she took in the papers. "This," I said calmly, "is my life's work." She sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the first deed. You own all of these?" I nodded. "Yes." Quietly. Patiently. "I've been building this for decades. I didn't think it was necessary to tell you before, but now I need you to understand." Her eyes welled with tears as she flipped through the stack houses. Land, savings, investments. Each one carried my name, my signature. "Mom, I had no idea. Why didn't you ever tell me?" I smiled softly. "Because I wanted you to grow on your own, without relying on what I'd built. But Harper, it's important for you to see this now, not just because it's yours one day, but because I want you to understand your worth. You deserve to stand tall, not to be made small." She pressed her lips together, her shoulders shaking as she held back tears. "And Grant? He doesn't know any of this?" "No," I said firmly. "And he never will not unless I decide to show him. But I want you to know, Harper, that everything here is protected from him. If anything ever happens to me, it all goes directly to you. He won't see a cent." She let out a shaky laugh, wiping at her eyes. "I can't believe this. All this time he's been making fun of you for your handwriting, acting like he's so much smarter, and you're the one who's actually built something real." Her voice cracked on the last word, and I reached across the table, taking her hand. "Sweetheart, arrogance is loud. Real strength is quiet. Don't ever mistake noise for power." She squeezed my hand tightly, her tears falling freely now. "Mom, you're incredible. I don't know how you did all this alone." I smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "I did it because I had to, and because I wanted to leave you with more than memories. But Harper, the most important thing you need to know is this. You are stronger than you think. Don't let him convince you otherwise." For the first time in a long while, I saw something change in her eyes. Determination. Resolve. The spark I had been waiting for. That night, after she left, I sat at the table alone, staring at the documents once more. My messy signature covered every page, a constant reminder of everything I had built. Grant thought he was clever. He thought he held the upper hand. But soon, he would see the truth. That the very handwriting he mocked was the same handwriting that had secured his downfall. Because these papers weren't just legalities. They were proof. Proof of who I was, of what I had built, of the power he could never touch. And when the time came, I would place them in front of him, one by one. I wouldn't need to raise my voice. I wouldn't need to mock him back. The ink would do all the speaking for me. And soon, Grant would see it all laid bare. The confrontation happened in the very living room he thought was beneath him. It was a Friday evening when it all came to a head. Harper had invited me over for dinner. She wanted comfort. She had called earlier in the week, her voice tired, telling me how Grant had been on edge again, how he was snapping at her for small things. I knew it was coming. Pressure always made men like Grant lash out harder. And I knew it was time. I carried the thick folder of documents with me when I arrived. Inside were the deeds, the trust papers, my will, and every carefully placed signature that bore my messy scrawl. Each page was another nail in the coffin of his arrogance. The atmosphere in the house was tense. Harper tried to mask it, bustling around the kitchen, setting out plates. But I could feel it in the air, heavy and sharp. Grant sat in the living room with a drink in hand, flipping channels on the TV with exaggerated nonchalance. When dinner was served, things started civil enough. Harper and I chatted, passing dishes back and forth, while Grant contributed only occasional remarks. But as the meal went on, his temper slipped. "Harper," he said suddenly, his voice sharper than usual, "did you pay that bill I reminded you about? Or did you forget again?" Harper froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. I thought you said you'd handle it this time," he scoffed. "Of course you did. You always think someone else will handle it." "Honestly, Harper, sometimes I don't know what you'd do without me." Her face fell, her eyes lowering to her plate. And that was when I'd had enough. I set down my fork, wiped my mouth calmly, and stood. Both of them looked at me in surprise. Without a word, I left the table, walked to the entryway, and returned with the folder. I set it down firmly on the coffee table in front of Grant. "What's this?" he asked, frowning. "Reality," I said evenly. He smirked, trying to cover his unease. "Reality? What are you talking about?" I opened the folder and spread the first document across the table, a deed, with my name and my signature bold at the bottom. "This," I said calmly, "is ownership." Grant blinked, then forced a laugh. Yes, we've been through this before. You own this house. Congratulations." I slid another document across another deed, then another, and another. Each one stamped, sealed, undeniable. Each one signed in the handwriting he had ridiculed. The laughter drained from his face as the pile grew. His eyes darted from page to page, his lips parting as he realized this wasn't just one house. It was several. "This can't be," he muttered, his voice trailing off. "Oh, but it is," I said softly. "Every property, every investment, every account signed, sealed, secured, all under my name. And do you know what ties them all together, Grant? This." I tapped the messy signature at the bottom of the page. The very handwriting he mocked stared back at him in black ink. Harper gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mom." I turned to her, my voice gentler. "This is yours one day, Harper. It's all protected for you. Everything I've built will go to you, not him. He cannot touch it. Not now, not ever." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at me, then back at the stack of papers. Grant, however, sat frozen. His pride was collapsing in real time, crumbling beneath the weight of reality. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. But no words came. I leaned forward slightly, my gaze steady. "You've spent months mocking my handwriting, turning it into a joke. But that handwriting is the only reason you're not drowning right now. That handwriting put a roof over your head when your arrogance left you with nothing, and that handwriting will ensure you have no claim to what you never earned." The silence in the room was deafening. Grant's face flushed red. He looked at Harper as though waiting for her to come to his defense, but she didn't. Her eyes were fixed on the documents, her expression a mixture of awe and realization. For the first time, she saw the full truth, not just about me, but about him. He tried one last time to salvage his pride. Well, maybe if you'd been more open about this sooner, we wouldn't be in this mess. You could have helped earlier." I shook my head slowly. "Help isn't given to the arrogant, Grant. Help is given to those who respect it. And you never respected me, or Harper, or anyone else. You don't deserve what I've built." His jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, but the papers in front of him left him powerless. My signature had already spoken louder than any words could. Harper finally broke the silence, her voice trembling but firm. "Grant, do you see now? Do you see who you've been mocking all this time?" He looked at her, but he had no answer. He just sat there, small and silent, his drink forgotten on the table beside him. For me, it wasn't anger I felt in that moment. It wasn't even triumph. It was peace. Peace in knowing that I had finally reclaimed the respect he had tried to strip away. Peace in knowing that Harper saw the truth with her own eyes. I gathered the documents slowly, placing them back into the folder. My messy signature stared up at me from the last page before I closed it. Imperfect, crooked, chaotic, and utterly powerful. I stood, smoothing my blouse, and said quietly, "This house, this family, this legacy, it's mine. And you'd do well to remember that." Grant said nothing. He couldn't. Harper looked at me with tears in her eyes, then nodded firmly. "Thank you, Mom." And in that moment, I knew the tide had turned. For once, Grant had nothing to say. Exposure is a sharper weapon than any insult. After that night in the living room, the energy inside Harper's house changed. It wasn't immediate, not all at once, but I could feel the shift in the air every time I stepped through the door. Grant was quieter, smaller somehow, like a balloon that had been pricked with a pin. He still walked around, still tried to puff out his chest, but there was no real air left to carry him. He avoided me as much as he could, retreating to his laptop or his phone whenever I visited. If we did happen to cross paths, he kept his words clipped and polite, never daring to joke about my handwriting again. That silence was telling. It wasn't that he had learned respect. No, Grant wasn't the kind of man to change so easily. What he had learned was fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of the truth being laid bare again in front of him, undeniable, in black and white. And honestly, that suited me just fine. For weeks, he tread carefully. But his ego couldn't stay buried forever. Arrogance like his always claws its way back to the surface. And when it did, it was almost pathetic to watch. One evening, Harper invited me over for dinner again. She had been glowing lately, lighter, freer. I could see it in her smile, in the way she carried herself. The weight of Grant's ridicule had lessened since that confrontation, and it showed. She had started standing straighter, speaking with more confidence, even laughing again without hesitation. But Grant, well, he hadn't fared as well. That evening, as we sat down to eat, he attempted to reclaim some ground. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink, and said, "You know, I've been talking with some contacts. There are some big opportunities on the horizon. Harper and I could be set for life once this deal goes through." Harper stiffened slightly, but I could see her eyes flicker toward me. She wasn't fooled anymore. She knew the sound of empty promises. I kept my expression neutral. "Is that so?" I asked softly. Grant straightened, his voice gaining momentum. "Yes. It's a tech startup cutting edge. I've got a seat at the table, and once we launch, the returns will be massive. We'll finally be where we deserve to be." I let the silence stretch for a moment before I answered. "Interesting. And will your name be on the papers this time, Grant? Or will you just be writing on someone else's signature?" The words landed with precision. Harper's lips pressed together, fighting a smile she didn't want to show. Grant, however, froze, his face flushing red. That's not fair," he stammered. "I've been working hard to—" I leaned forward, my voice calm but sharp. "No, Grant, what's not fair is belittling a woman for her handwriting when that handwriting owns the roof over your head. What's not fair is mocking Harper in front of her friends, making her feel small, when she deserves far better than your fragile pride." The silence that followed was suffocating. Harper looked down at her plate, but her lips curved upward just slightly, like she had been waiting for someone to finally say those words out loud. Grant tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow. You really think you've got me figured out, don't you? I didn't flinch. I don't have to figure you out. You've shown me everything already. Every insult, every smirk, every empty promise, it all speaks louder than words. He looked at Harper then, desperate for her defense, but she didn't offer it. She simply met his gaze and said quietly, "She's right." That moment was devastating for him. I saw it in the way his shoulders sagged, in the way he turned his face away. Harper had always cushioned him before, always softened his blows, always covered his failings. But now, she was siding with me. She was siding with the truth. And the truth was simple. His power was gone. From that night onward, things only grew colder between them. Harper grew closer to me, calling more often, visiting more frequently, her confidence blossoming with every conversation. She asked me questions about investments, about independence, about how I had built what I had, and I answered, happy to pass along the lessons I had learned. Grant, meanwhile, kept his distance. He moved like a man living in someone else's shadow, because that's exactly what he was. The house he lived in wasn't his. The money that supported them wasn't his. Even the future Harper now envisioned didn't include him in the way it once had. Every time his eyes fell on my signature, the crooked, messy lines he had mocked so many times, I could see the flicker of humiliation. It was a reminder he couldn't escape. He tried, once, to reclaim some dignity. He approached me in the garden one afternoon while Harper was inside. "Listen," he said stiffly. "I just want to clear the air. Maybe I went too far with the jokes before, but you have to admit, your handwriting isn't exactly normal." I set down the trowel I'd been holding and looked at him. "Normal doesn't matter, Grant. Power doesn't care about perfection. It only cares about permanence. And my signature, messy as it is, will outlast every careless word you've ever spoken." His jaw clenched, but he didn't reply. He turned and walked back into the house without another word. And that was the last attempt he made to confront me. Because deep down, he knew. He knew he'd been exposed, not just to me, but to Harper. He knew that the foundation of his arrogance had been stripped away, replaced with nothing but hollow pride. And he knew that from now on, every time he looked at me or at Harper, he would see the truth staring back at him. The truth that my handwriting, the thing he had mocked relentlessly, was the very thing that secured everything he envied but could never control. And all of it was sealed with the handwriting he once mocked. In the end, revenge wasn't about humiliation, it was about respect. After the confrontation, life didn't magically transform overnight. These things never do. But the balance in Harper's home had shifted permanently, and it was only a matter of time before the ripples turned into waves. Harper carried herself differently. She wasn't timid at the dinner table anymore. She wasn't quick to laugh at Grant's half-hearted jokes. She wasn't apologizing for herself at every turn. I saw her shoulders square, her voice steady, her eyes sharper than they'd been in years. It was as if finally seeing the truth, seeing me lay out those documents, seeing Grant silenced by reality, had unlocked something in her. She began to believe in her own strength. And for the first time in a long while, my daughter was free from the cage of his belittling words. Grant, on the other hand, was a shadow of the man he once pretended to be. His arrogance had always been loud, filling the room whether you invited it in or not. Now, the silence around him was deafening. He moved through the house like an unwelcome guest, careful not to provoke, careful not to expose himself further. And every time his eyes fell on me, I saw it, the memory of that folder. Those deeds, those crooked signatures staring back at him. He couldn't laugh at them anymore. He couldn't reduce me to a joke, because now, he knew what my handwriting really meant. It meant power. It meant security. It meant he was living in a house that wasn't his, supported by a woman he had underestimated from the very beginning. The irony of it was almost poetic. He had mocked me for the one thing that defined his downfall. Weeks turned into months, and the tension in their home simmered. Harper grew stronger, speaking up more, asserting herself in ways that made Grant visibly uncomfortable. She questioned his business schemes, challenged his empty promises, and reminded him often that his big plans had nearly destroyed them once before. And slowly, I saw the truth dawn on her fully. She didn't need him. One afternoon, she came to my house alone. She sat at my kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her expression serious. "Mom," she said softly, "I think I'm done." I reached across the table, taking her hand. "Done? With him?" she whispered. "With the ridicule, with the constant arrogance, with pretending everything's fine when it isn't. I deserve better. And I know that now." Tears filled my eyes. But this time they weren't from sadness. They were from pride. "Yes, you do," I said firmly. "You always have." She nodded, determination flickering in her gaze. "I don't know what comes next, but I think I'm ready to find out." I squeezed her hand, my heart swelling. For years, I had watched her shrink under the weight of his arrogance. Now, I was watching her stand tall again. And that, more than anything, was the victory I had wanted all along. As for Grant, he never regained his footing. He stayed in the house for a while longer, his pride in tatters, his voice subdued. But he never mocked me again, not once. Every time my handwriting appeared on a note, on a grocery list, on a label, it wasn't a joke anymore. It was a reminder of his defeat. He had learned in the most humiliating way that real power doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from quiet, steady strength. Eventually, Harper made her decision. She told him she wanted space, that she couldn't live under his shadow anymore. His reaction was predictable: anger, denial, desperate promises to change. But she had already seen the truth. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The last time I saw him, he was carrying a suitcase out of the house, his face pale and tight. He didn't look at me as he passed, didn't say a word. He just walked out the door, leaving behind the life he had taken for granted. And I felt nothing but peace. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about humiliating him or making him suffer. It was about reclaiming the respect he had tried to strip away, not just for me, but for Harper too. In the quiet of my garden, I thought often about how it all unfolded. How something as small as handwriting, messy, uneven, imperfect, had been the weapon that brought down his arrogance. The irony made me smile every time I picked up my pen, every time I scribbled a note in my journal. My handwriting hadn't changed. It was still crooked, still hurried, still mine. But now, it wasn't a source of ridicule. It was a symbol of survival, a symbol of power, a symbol of the downfall of a man who thought he could laugh at me, forever. And when I looked at Harper, stronger, freer, finally breathing without his shadow, I knew I had done the right thing. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. It isn't cruel. It isn't even meant to destroy. Sometimes, revenge is simply the act of standing tall, of refusing to be made small, of letting the truth speak louder than arrogance ever could. And in my case, revenge was nothing more than ink on paper, my messy signature. The very thing he mocked, the very thing that sealed his fate. Because my messy signature was the mark of his downfall.